Okay. So
So we are here to do the discussion. So we don't want to cut the discussion on the side. So we actually planned second day and third day also relatively flexible. So everybody to the talk and we have one detailed discussion is definitely.
Okay. All right, fine. Shall I choose?
Okay, so the second speaker is Emmanuel Pothos. He has been also quite, he has been playing an important role in quantum cognition. And recently he wrote a quite important review paper in annual review in psychology, right, on quantum cognition. And hopefully that makes also, this field quite visible and accepted in the psychology.
Well, no, thanks very much for your kind words, and Makiko and everybody, thanks for organizing and getting us here. So I'm going to talk about ambivalence, and I suppose that's going to be a way to talk about a couple of problems I've been having recently. So just very briefly, so I've kind of been putting some psychology notes as well. So I understand some mixed audience. There are some physicists, there are some people interested in cognition. So when talking about ambivalence, what I mean is the sensation we sometimes have of back and forth when we're trying to make a decision we're not sure about. So especially in poorly matched options, for example, suppose you're trying to decide between spending money on a jumper versus going on a movie. You can't match up the attributes. There is an intuition, at least sometimes, that we go back and forth. We're close to one option, then change our minds, then change our minds back, etc. Okay, so the reason why I was interested in ambivalence is because in some quantum-like cognitive models, people are using unitary operators. And as you know, with unitary operators, there is oscillatory behavior. So we kind of thought, well, maybe this oscillatory behavior in unitary operators tells us something about human cognition as well. So that was kind of, I suppose, the starting point. And then we can ask whether there is any evidence that preference can oscillate with time. That's the main question. So is the case of human preference goes back and forth prior to converging to some opinion. And yeah, there is a little bit of evidence. So apparently back in the 60s and the 70s, these individuals reported some up and down pattern of preference shifts. But it's difficult to study dynamics of preference directly. And the closest people have done recently is work by Peter Kwon, Gerald, and Tim Pleskaj. And what you see here is this is you can't really read that, but it's preference for a particular opinion, and this is seconds after an initial response. And you can see there is an impression of back and forth across two experiments. But what Gerald and his students did is they basically asked they offered the choice to participants, and then they kept asking them at different time points. For example, what was the participant? For example, one participant would be asked at different time points throughout the decision process, and it was on this basis that these curves were constructed. Now, that's a sensible approach. It kind of gets in the way a little bit with the idea that sometimes decisions can alter preference states. Now, leaving aside quantum for a second, there's a fairly sizable literature that when we make a particular choice or decision, this can alter our underlying preference state. And in quantum, recently we've tried to obtain evidence for a quantum Zinn effect. Quantum Zinn effect is, if you're familiar with the expression, a watched pot never boils. It's as if you keep measuring, if you imagine how quantum dynamics work, say if you imagine like a two-dimensional space and you start your mental space close to one eigenstate, if you keep measuring that state while you're close to an eigenstate, well, what's going to happen? It's going to project right where it started. So that is evidence for quantum Zinn effect. This is a survival probability. It's probability of no change from the initial judgment as you vary the number of intermediate judgments. So all that we did in the context of a murder mystery. So it was a hypothetical murder mystery. The participants was initially considered innocent. We kept offering piece of evidence that the person was actually guilty, and we varied the number of intermediate judgments around exactly the same sequence of pieces of evidence that the person was guilty. And essentially, the common hypothesis is that as the number of intermediate judgments goes increasing, the survival probability increases as well. That is, the probability that people will retain their initial opinion despite the evidence to the contrary increases, which is quite interesting. By the way, note this is not strictly monotonically going up because, well, we did use POVMs, and of course, if you have a lot of intermediate judgments, the small error per measurement adds up. And when we asked earlier about classical models, so that's the Bayesian prediction is completely wrong, because in standard Bayesian statistics, you can't, of course, you can't natively change the state as a result of the measurement.
Very quick question. So in this kind of setup, is a discrete measurement versus continuous measurement very different?
So it's a decision paradigm. There are I think 12 pieces of evidence, discrete pieces of evidence, piloted to be equivalent individually, and then you present each piece of evidence one after the other, and you manipulate intermediate judgments. So you tell participants, at this point, do you think he's guilty or not? Do you think he's guilty or not, etc. But yeah, it's all discrete piece of evidence.
Would the quantum model make a different prediction between the continuous measurement? The reason why I'm asking this is that maybe you are going to talk about it in this, but inside physics, especially, we can actually do, let's say, use mouse or something to continuously report what you're seeing.
As far as I understand this, it should not make any difference because the only thing you care about is your evolution away from the agent state where you started. Now, with discrete piece of evidence, we assume it's like, one step. With continuous, we imagine there are going to be a lot of smaller steps, but it shouldn't really matter. What should matter is the density of intermediate judgments. So there's another graph here. Again, I'm gonna put all this stuff in the overheads in case people want them, but I won't sort of spend time on everything. This is not important. But this is another illustration of the quantum effect. This is for the condition with 12 intermediate judgments. You look at survival probability after a different number of judgments. So in this condition, participants were asked a question after each piece of in this condition, participants were asked to make a judgment after each piece of information. And again, although it does go down in both cases because of error, it goes down a lot more slowly in the quantum case than the Bayesian case, which is another illustration of the quantum effect. So anyway, the upshot of all this is that if we want to study ambivalence and preference, maybe just having a lot of intermediate judgments within participants is not the most it's kind of like getting in the way of such constructive influence effects. So what we thought we would do is we'd use eye tracking. So we essentially study the eye fixations across two different choices with time, and we'll try to model these attentional dynamics instead of preference dynamics. We kind of assume that attention dynamics and decision dynamics are not completely separate. I mean, you've got a lot of psychophysicists here, so you probably know about this more than I do. But in any case, there is some evidence that attentional biases go hand in hand with decisional biases. So that's kind of the psychology bit in terms of this work. So what we did is we collected eye tracking data for pretty much decision. We expect some back and forth between areas of interest corresponding to the information for different options. Maybe that's not surprising. More subtly, we wanted to actually model these eye tracking carriers. And that's actually not been done before because people doing eye tracking aren't typically interested in modeling the carriers. But we, coming from a quantum-like cognition research program, we had these unitary operators, and we thought, that's maybe what we should be doing. Okay, so I'll go through the paradigm a little bit, just for the psychologists. we had three scenarios. Participants were asked to make a decision as if in the shoes of different protagonists. So the decisions were fully matched decisions, like buying a house, going to the cinema, or keeping a stray dog. For each decision, we offered a whole bunch of pros and cons, and each pro or a con would be a simple statement summarized by a label. Now, in some pre-tests, we had participants rate the pros and cons, so we matched them to achieve balance. So essentially, we created three very ambiguous decision situations. That's an example of what participants saw. So they're like, on this area of interest, in this example, you see cons. So for example, it's about buying a house. The house is on a busy street and they do not like the noise so much. Or the house is a bit more expensive and they were planning expensive. These are all cons. They were summarized by label. And there were lots of pros as well. One pro we offered them is there's a big park close by, which would be great for leisure activities. So that's what participants saw. They spent some time looking at this screen to just understand the pros and the cons and the labels. And then in the actual decision trials, they just saw just the labels and then two buckets. Let's buy a house, not buy a house. That was the eye tracking paradigm. The paradigm is very straightforward. Participants would do a scenario. They see the pros and cons, then the labels. Then they'll ask to make the decision a second time for a fixed time. And then we have a couple of ratings. If you've not seen eye tracking studies before, actually, they're not very interesting to look at because it's just a computer with the eye tracker. But that was essentially all the setup that's required to do an eye tracking study. I'll go through some behavioral results quickly, just to especially for the psychologists, to give you a feel of what the results look like. But then, obviously, I suppose more of our interest is how we try to model that and the questions we have in relation to this. So we count fixation durations within time units of 200 milliseconds. There are two areas of interest, as I said, one for pros and one for cons. And there were fixation durations in two categories, pros, cons, and neither. So neither would be dead time as well, where participants would sort of be fixating outside the areas of interest or blinking, etc. That's called the typical scan part. So the side of the circles shows the degree of fixation. I mean, that pattern is typical. Right? It's more or less what you expect. So this one just fixating, across the areas of interest along different labels, depending on what's more salient for them. That's the eventual decision they make. If you there is a famous effect whereby we tend to fixate more so to the option we eventually choose. We can't replicate that amongst other things, but it's not our interest here. Our interest is basically these carriers. So these are eye tracking carriers. They already look quite noisy. And actually that was after some really heavy smoothing as well. So I ran a Baseba with collected this data and she sort of put together the model we ended up using. So this is time. This is a proportion of fixation. So the blue, red, and green curves. I think green is yes, blue no, red neither. They should up to 1. I mean, we can't want to model that. Ideally, with a quantum-like model. Now, why a quantum-like model is going to something different? We'll try to justify this later. It's not that there are any other models we're using. So, as I said earlier, people have not really tried to model these eye tracking curves. I mean, there's no interest to model them. And primarily our interest in trying to model them was exactly because we want to see whether it was, unitary dynamics, the sort of back and forth embedded in unitary dynamics might help us capture some of the structure in there.
Oh, red is no.
Sorry?
Red is no.
I don't remember because I can't find out the screen share. Green is pros, red is no, yeah, and blue is neither. Yeah, you're right. Those both. Okay, so Okay, so basic behavioral findings, participants were asked to make decisions. They correlated number of transitions correlated to response time, signed average pros cons difference related to first decision. So all this is kind of peace of mind results, nothing really surprising. So I mean, a major challenge people like me have is how to actually convince those psychologists that to be interested in quantum-like tools. And the way we try to do that here is by essentially saying, well, are there like oscillations? You know, hint, maybe unitary dynamics. But of course, we don't really expect indefinite oscillations. We expect eventual convergence to the chosen option. So essentially, we look for gradual quenched oscillations, and that motivated our approach to use open system dynamics. So, but I mean, psychologists aren't just going to take our word for it, right? So that's a big challenge in talking to psychologists. They don't like mathematics in general, and especially they don't like new kinds of mathematics. So you can't try extra hard to convince them that a new mathematical instrument is worth adopting. So, in order to motivate the idea that perhaps open system dynamics are relevant here, we essentially wanted to show that there is an empirical pattern of gradually quenched oscillations that are our best bet for how to describe our understanding of open system dynamics. So we'd like to know whether if there are any oscillations, these are progressively of lower amplitude. I'll just briefly say what we did, just don't want to take too much time with these details. So what we did is we computed the absolute value of the first derivative in different time days for the pros and cons eye tracking errors. And then we constructed a linear regression. Again, statistical details are not important. This is what's important. So this is the across 5 different time periods, we computed the average absolute first derivative of these pros and cons curves. And essentially what we see is that this goes down in all cases. So we offered this to our psychology colleagues as evidence that there seems to be a pattern of gradually quenched oscillations. And maybe as a result, this idea of using open system dynamics is reasonable. So that was, I suppose, the empirical motivation we tried to harness in order to justify our use of the particular modeling. Okay, so in terms of how to actually model this data, I mean, there are various choices. So just if you remember, I've said twice already that nobody has actually tried to model eye tracking curves. That is true. I mean, one might be tempted to employ something like sequential sampling or drift diffusion models, but typically these models do not reverse preference or do not reverse propensity towards a decision. Interactive activation models by Gluckner and his colleagues. So Gluckner was one of our co-authors in this work. Again, they can sort of do it, but in a slightly descriptive way. Overall, the problem is that for a lot of these models, there is a semi-monotonic convergence to the eventual decision. And the second problem is that it's not straightforward to feed curves directly as we want to do. So that's a picture from Adele Diderik's from Adele Diderik. So that's essentially probability for a particular response. That curve is computed from one of Jerome's drift diffusion models, and the only way you can get a single reversal is if the initial bias is opposite to the others. So that kind of gives you an example of the fact that if you look at traditional sequential sampling models, you can't really get these reversals, which is, I suppose, the characteristic of unitary dynamics, which is, what motivates again our use of quantum. Okay, so I'm going to go over here in relation to opinion change in quantum theory. And I mean, there are a couple of options as far as we understand mathematics, but it's important to know that we don't really know what's the correct one. So that's something that, we love feedback. So opinion change and quantum theory. Now, as we understand things, there are three options. First of all, one can use Luther's law, which is essentially the quantum rule for computing conditional probabilities. So for something like probability A given X and Y, so essentially we're trying to evaluate a particular question A on the basis of two pieces of evidence. We would project onto X, then onto Y, then normalize and project onto A. Now, an advantage of this approach is that it produces order effects in evaluation of evidence. And there is plenty of empirical data for such effect. In fact, some very funny and amusing experiments in relation to medical diagnosis or jury decision making. So Luther's law, certainly seems to give us some empirical mileage. The problem with Luther's law is that it kind of assumes that you project onto each piece of given information. Now, we don't really know whether that's an appropriate metaphor for some cognitive processes. It kind of assumes that with Luther's law, it kind of assumes that, well, you project into here, then project into there, normalize and project into here. But of course, each projection in quantum theory is a big deal, right? You change your state in a I suppose, non-smooth way. Now, the second way for how to capture opinion change with quantum theory is unitary evolution. And well, if you've got a particular question and a particular piece of evidence, such as X1, well, you can consider the strength of X1 in isolation, right? You can look at it and say, well, given just X1, how confident am I about A? And then you can sort of compute some angle, and then you can basically say that in general, of an arbitrary mental state, maybe what I do is when I see X1, I rotate towards A, by a degree which is proportional to how close X1 is to A. So essentially, you just kind of calculate I suppose what you're claiming is that the more closely associated a piece of evidence is the question. If you have an arbitrary mental state, the more you just rotate towards that mental state. Now, unitary evolution by itself is not ideal. So first of all, it's commutative, so you lose order effects, and that's not a good thing. That seems to go against a lot of empirical data. And the second problem is that you also overshoot. So if one is kind of like, without so much elaboration, adopts the suggestion I just made, then if you start with the mental state that's already very close to A, you just overshoot by a large amount. Now, that's not completely crazy psychologically. There is some evidence of so-called less is more effect, where sometimes you combine rewards or combine evidence and you actually overshoot, but not to that extent. So just straight unitary evolution also doesn't simplify do it for us. And I mean, some people, not very many people, James Hughes for one, have explored time-dependent harmonics. So I'll just go briefly through that. There are some bits of math here which sort of like include for completeness, but we don't particularly want to go through them in detail here. But the idea in the model James get the quantum zero model was that even though each piece of evidence was identically strong, they were weighted depending on the position in the sequence. And his model was based on a unitary operator like this. So just bear with me for a second. So you've got them. So this is the unitary rotation between evidence M and N. And it's based on this quantity beta here. And beta specifies the rotation for the mental state when presenting a piece of evidence M to N, as I said. But the point about beta is that essentially it's computed in such a way. So here is the total presentation of the M piece of evidence. So we've got it over there. And another piece of here. AIs are the strengths of the individual piece of evidence in isolation. So, that would be, we didn't take into account any sequence effects. These beta parameters are a measure of risky or primacy effect. So essentially, the way you set this up is even though each piece of evidence is identically strong, the way they combine together depends on their position in the sequence. And you basically have an effect of diminishing returns. So if you've already seen loads and loads of evidence that the person is guilty, seeing a bit more evidence doesn't really cut it for you, right? Which is reasonable, but again, it involves like a bit of extra mathematical machinery that's not as common in quantum cognition. Okay, so the third option for opinion change is to use the Lindblad form of the master equation. So Andrei has kind of pioneered the use of discount dynamics in quantum cognitive models. So the model I'll describe shortly, next over it was put together by Irina and Andrei was good. So I mean the Lindblad form of the master equation. So that's got a couple of advantages, some technical advantages and some theoretical ones. So let me just kind of like, first of all, just show you the next two slides from James Heasley's tutorial on quantum theory that kind of really made the case for me in terms of how we could use it in cognition. So we're talking now about a particular form, the quantum optical master equation, and it looks very, very ugly. But we can ignore all these things, just make some simplifications. So no Hamiltonian, set the parameters in a certain way, and that's the thing that matters. So that's the state at time t as a function of this gamma parameter and time. And what you can see is that as time becomes large, this gets 0, this gets 0, this gets 0, and this gets 1. So essentially, that's kind of like that's convergence to a particular state rather than a later behavior. Now, the problem, the thing I don't understand, or I suppose we don't understand very well in relation to discount dynamics is that discount seems to work quite well if you have a single piece of evidence. But in the vast majority of psychological applications, we have multiple pieces of evidence. And what we're interested in is how they combine together. And we don't really know how to do this in a way that's kind of elegant and seamless as in unitary all right, okay. Sorry. And we don't really know how to combine the impact of different pieces of evidence as seamlessly as for unitary dynamics. So that's kind of another challenge we have. So in any case, I suppose what I kind of wanted to show you, especially those of you who've been in the quantum cognition problem for a while, is that this kind of like seemingly straightforward problem how to compute the impact of one piece of information in a particular question. Well, even though there are some kind of like technically sophisticated options, there is uncertainty as to what's the best way forward. We honestly don't know. And in the literature, well, with the exception of the open system dynamics options, all the others have been employed quite a bit. All right, so in any case, what we did this time for our iterating curves is we did follow the open system dynamics option, but but we just ignored the fact that we had multiple pieces of information. We just essentially use this as a curve as an equation for modeling curves. Now, the sort of apart from the technical advantage of having something that converges to a particular state, the thing that I found appealing about using open quantum systems in cognition is that you basically have this contrast, this clash between the dynamics for the closed part of the system, which gives you indefinite oscillation, and the dynamics or the interaction between the system and the environment, which usually, but not always, gives you stabilization. Of course, if you're a psychologist, the first thing that you ask is, okay, so I mean, in physics, perhaps you have some notion of what these things are, what is the environment, what's the system, but how does that really translate in relation to cognition? What is system and what is environment? And if now we're taking a step back here and pointing out that the idea of sort of environment for a particular cognitive process has a very, very long history in psychology. In fact, it's one of the kind of most elusively difficult problems. So, I mean, at a simple level, for any particular cognitive task, you could argue that the system is the information specific to the task, and the environment is the general knowledge of the person. But how to capture this notion of general knowledge? So there's a very famous proposal for categorization by Murphy and Medin a while back. And Murphy and Medin claimed that well, actually, we can't, and they're not the only ones, but they just said, well, actually, if we want to understand categorization, we just need to look at the theory that combines together the examples from different categories. But we've no idea how to do that in a formal way. So the advantage, so I suppose what the point I was trying to get to is that with open cognitive systems, the major advantage I see in cognitive modeling is that there is a promise here to take into account the influence of general knowledge without directly modeling. So that's the really big thing. I mean, of course, it's impossible to model the general knowledge of individuals because each one of us has vastly different knowledge. But if there is a way to if there is a way to actually model the impact of general knowledge without really understanding it, that would be a huge, huge advance. Okay, so let me also mention to you Jerry Fodor, who's a famous psychologist famous philosopher in psychology, and he famously, there's a lot of book, The Modularity of Mind, was back in 1983, and he had this really influential idea that there are certain cognitive processes which are modular and ones which are not. And his main idea was that the only process that we can study are basically these modular processes. So famously, I know now, we've got like these expert psychophysicists here, but like back in the 80s, from Pothos' point of view, the modular processes were perception, and the idea being that we see what's in front of us without our personality, general knowledge, expectations, whatever, affecting what we see, and language. Everything else, all higher cognition, according to Fodor, was what he called isotropic engrenian, which basically means that every single belief I have interacts with all the other beliefs. And if I change one belief, this impacts on everything else in my mind. It's this idea that essentially, when it comes to categorization, decision-making, beliefs, everything is hugely interconnected, which makes it, according to Fodor, impossible to study. But maybe if we employ open system dynamics, we can study making these certain approximations, but without really having to understand what is the exact nature of the general knowledge for each one of us. So there are all these kind of, I understand, of course, I appreciate that a lot of this is a bit vague right now, but I think, as well as our excitement for regarding the prospect of employing open system dynamics kind of relates to these ideas. The idea is that psychologists have been intrigued for a long time by the notion that there's a lot of general knowledge that seems to be impacting our decisions, beliefs, etc., but we can't really quantify it. But maybe with open system dynamics, we can sort of compute the approximations as a result of these interactions without really being precise about them. Okay, so right. So let me show you quickly the model that Irina, primarily Irina, put together for these eye tracking curves. There are things that will be familiar if you're a physicist, and they'll be too difficult to explain if you're not familiar with the equations. So all I'm going to point out is that the Limblad equation. This is a first derivative for the Emmanuel state. This is standard Schrödinger part, and this is the Limblad part. The Limblad part again has now this ugly form, but we don't care so much about it because we can rewrite it in a much simpler way. So we use the tripartite system for yes, undecided, and no, and having an eigenstate as undecided is an interesting choice. I can tell you about more if you want to. And the unitary part is not particularly important. It's basically something that creates oscillations. The Limblad part is the bit that's important. So let's look. So that's all this sort of ugliness that we can rewrite in this simple form. So we can rewrite it in terms of like 4 parts. For 2 parts, A1 to A32, or 4 parts, A1 to 3 to 1 and 2 3. So I'll get. I mean, you know, I know it's Monday and it's early, but I'll get to. I'll just show you what these matrices are for completeness, and then the next slide, we'll just pause a bit more and just tell you what they actually are, because this is what matters. So essentially, the Limblad part involves 4 separate drifts to different options. So this part is drift from uncertainty, state 2 to the yes option. This part is a drift from uncertainty to the no option. This one is drift from certainty to uncertainty, and this part is drift again from certainty to uncertainty. So the point, if you're familiar with sequential sampling models in psychology, this is really exciting because essentially what it tells you is you can switch on or off in your model drifts towards any particular option from any other option, or indeed across any combination of options. So you probably don't remember this now, but actually the C matrices that model these different parts of the master equation, they're very simple. You can make them more complex. So for example, we have a drift here from, I don't know, option both 1 and 3 towards uncertainty. So you have this flexibility in this formalism that you basically cannot match in standard sequential sampling models. It's as far as we know, it's only Andrei and Das and a handful of others that have employed this open systems dynamics. I mean, there are some technical problems, but nonetheless, conceptually, I think they go several steps beyond what people are currently doing with just standard sequential sampling models. But in any case, just to summarize, the take-home message here is that we have 4 different mechanisms. Well, actually, we have 2 model versions: one with all 4 mechanisms, one with only 2 mechanisms. And you know, this kind of equation just gives flexibility to play around with however many drifts you want. Okay, so just to reinforce the point, these parameters are basically drift rates in standard drift diffusion formalism. And then we had a time stretching parameter. We had a parameter dealing with oscillations in the Hamiltonian, and some soft Bounce-on parameters. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all these graphs. These are basically examples of how the model behaves. And the thing that was surprising to me, and this wasn't surprising to Arena because familiar with the map, but the thing that was surprising to me was that the intrinsic oscillation in the system, determined by the D parameter in the Hamiltonian, basically fights it out with the parameters, with the Limblad parameters, which determine convergence. So in order to get, say, in a situation like this, you may have the drift towards this option higher than the drift for this option, right? But you're not going to get high probabilities unless the D parameter is fairly low as well. So I mean, psychologically, we have no idea whether this is true or not. But the idea is that there are going to be cases when the intrinsic oscillation of the problem is high enough, so that however the evidence, however big the drifts, you don't really converge. I mean, there's an awful lot of psychology here that is completely untested because, you know, it's still like only early stages. But I suppose all we did is we just took the equation and we tried to fit the curves. But that was quite surprising to me at least. So this case in here is we reduce B and we stretch the drifts, and only then we get, say, probability for one option as high as 0.8. Okay, so all right, so main point, evidence accumulation towards particular options is balanced against the degree of intrinsic oscillation. There are no thresholds, no discrete decision points, which contrast with the sequential sampling models. And as I said, drifts can be specified towards any number and any combination of options. Okay, so I'm kind of nearly done, so you know, but hopefully we should have time for yours as well. So we just our null models were just mean-centered lines, which are not completely trivial given the data. We use the BIC fit function, and basically, well, we got. I mean, the quantum model was better than the null model. I mean, you know, I know that's a conclusive evidence for anything, but at least, you know, it was better than the null model by a fair amount. These are some examples. So we fit the curves from each participant individually. I mean, it's a difficult prediction problem, and maybe it's not the best area of application anyway. But you know, at least relative to the null models, these quantum-like models did all right. Okay, so let me summarize. So the main point is, I suppose the main challenge we have currently is that you know, we've got a demonstration of the in-principle relevance. We have what we think is reasonable theoretical motivation. What we're liking is some sort of like exciting prediction to tempt psychologists, because psychologists are not going to be interested in something like this unless you package it in the context of a prediction that's generated, like for example, Jerk has found with the quantum question equality. So I mean that's where we are. I mean, ideally we have something that allows us to harness these insights about general knowledge with some precision, you know, towards prediction, but we're not quite there yet. So I'll finish by sharing Peter and Jerome's book. I always show the book cover at the end of my talks. One might think I'm on commission, but actually I'm not. But anyway, there we are. So thanks.
Thank you. I think, yeah, your talk contained a lot of things and things to discuss. So maybe we probably will need a lot of time to discuss, I think, right? So let's get any comments or questions from you. Do you have anything? Yeah, can you go to the mic? Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for a very expansive. Can you, I just have a very simple question. Can you just go back to the previous slide? I just want to get your a bit more, the first point there. Can the transition from quantum-like to non-quantum-like relate to the focus on the specifics of the task? Can you just elaborate on that a bit?
Well, it goes to what Peter was asking earlier, and so I've got the second presentation tomorrow on why quantum, and fundamentally that's one of the biggest problems we have in the quantum cognition research program. So the first problem is we don't know where incompatibility comes from, and the second one is that we don't really know why certain things are compatible and certain things are incompatible. I mean, our best guess currently is that the transition from compatibility to incompatibility relates to things like familiarity, or perhaps the style of the participant, whether they're more analytic versus more reflective, very reflexive. Or it could relate to situations where there is genuine contextuality in the properties, as for example, Wittgenstein conceptual combination. There will be question pairs that are actually contextual, you know. So I suppose that's kind of like that's I suppose one aspect of this question. Another aspect to this question is whether I suppose in the most ideal world, what we'd like to show is something like when there is greater influence from general knowledge, we get stronger convergence because that's how this linear dynamics work. But we did try to do that actually in this experiment. So we tried to get participants to tell us how much experience they have with these particular questions, and we thought that maybe if they have more experience, then we get a faster convergence. That it'd be like a stronger interaction with the environment, but we didn't get the result. But it was kind of a long shot anyway. But I mean, these are kind of broad ideas, but they're very vague, and I appreciate that. But again, that's where we are.
I have something. By the way, maybe we'll use the philosophers convention of using this to follow up question, and then this is a separate question.
I don't want to confuse the
Follow up. Interview that skip the order. But anyway, I have one follow up. So what you said also relates to Fodor's idea of modality, modularity, corresponds to the idea that whether if there isn't a specialized circuit in your brain, then that might prioritize the process of the things, and then that may not induce a huge amount of contextual interaction with other system, and then doesn't produce quantum-like effects. Whereas if there is no such a specialized circuit in the brain, and then it involves activation across different areas, then it might induce more quantum-like behavior. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. The more specialized and more isolated, well, right. I mean, right. So if you take at face value what I said earlier is the more isolated, the more unitary, and the less isolated, the more interacting with the rest of our geometry, etc. The more sort of linear-like, that is faster convergence, fewer oscillations. But I mean, I mean, something like this is going to depend on all sorts of things, like for example, the dynamics, both at the Limburg level and at the Hamiltonian level. But that is, I mean, at face value, the most kind of trivial prediction is that the more I suppose the more your approach to a particular problem interacts with the rest of your knowledge, the more the stronger the interaction with the environment in a way. So the stronger you get the convergence. I mean, I wouldn't want to say whether that's a proper prediction. It's not. I mean, it's just like the sort of knee-jerk intuition from the mathematics that clearly needs quite a bit of further work.
Yeah, something like that has been kind of observed or suggested in attention literature. Then go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting work, because I think one of the problems there has been in quantum cognition is how to do the dynamics. So when you look at how when the field started, a lot of it was really quite structural, and then how cognitive states evolve has been one of the real hard problems that has been trying to be addressed by the community. And I think this particular approach offers some really interesting avenues for further investigation. I guess the issue that we have is that regardless of what we use for the dynamics like Hamiltonians, we're so young in this field, we don't really have any principal basis to actually set the parameters in a Hamiltonian, whereas in physics there might be conservation of energy principles or something. We don't have that yet. And I think until we get that, we won't be able to be more secure in terms of our dynamics might be as much sort of foundly established on top of a foundation that this can be motivated from some sort of first principles or whatever.
So you're absolutely right. So, I mean, for me, the biggest problem is whether one employs Luther's law or something like unitary linear evolution when it comes to, I think the pragmatic, I mean, the very common problem in decision making is how do you update your knowledge of the question on the basis of a series of evidence? And I think the choice between Luther's law versus either unitary dynamics or something else is just completely unclear to me. When it comes to parameters, so, I mean, in some cases, as you know, people have tried to say build Hamiltonians on the basis of like, say, if you have like something like Presence dilemma, the parameters might correspond to utilities. But of course, it's not quite a neat translation between these assumptions and whatever happens under the hood. When it comes to the Lindblad, these matrices, that is actually a bit simpler because you can, the way this is set up is that each of these alpha parameters corresponds to a particular drift towards a set of options. So, you know, I mean, you can imagine how you might have some independent way to set these parameters, right? For example, they could be utilities towards different options or something like this. But yes, I mean, I completely agree with you. It is, I mean, so as part of the problem is that the even Schrödinger dynamics is just more complicated. You know, once you have the Hamiltonian, you should your parameter as well. It doesn't quite work in a straightforward way.
Look, just as a follow-up to that, this is really the point that I wanted to get to, and that sort of follows up what Stephen was saying, and that's that first one there. We have been doing some experiments where we show subjects or participants like a face, and the face could be real or it could be AI generated. Now, nowadays, it's really, some of them, it's really, really hard to tell. And so what we did this experiment, and then we pretended that what they're doing is they're looking at a face, and then we have this sort of AI system behind, and the AI system gives also its judgment whether it's real or face, so classified. And and I'll be talking about this tomorrow. But what's interesting is this effect that you showed here is that initially, when the participant doesn't really know how to do it, how to judge it, we get them to look at 28 faces, and we get them to judge the reliability of the AI. So that's a proxy for, you know, like whether the AI is doing what they expect. And their reliability ratings oscillate. But as they go further into the task, the oscillations decrease. And I just wonder in relation to that first question, we were speculating whether they're starting to learn their own ways of doing it. And that sort of, compresses the oscillation. So even though they might not be getting any better objectively at the task, they feel that they're getting better at it. And so that it's in a sense, they built up some knowledge, some experience by doing it, and that's what compresses this uncertainty. So from a quantum point of view, initially we might assume that they're in an indeterminate cognitive state. But as they learn more and more, their cognitive state becomes more determinate and becomes more classical, and that's why then you can model it more easily, say with a Markov model, which doesn't have this, much harder to get this oscillating behavior. That's our speculation about it.
So in your case, do you have a feedback or no feedback?
The feedback is that, yeah, so the participant sees a face, they judge it whether it's real or fake, and then the AI sort of gives its judgment. So that's the feedback. So what we're doing is actually not, this is a completely different task, but I'll explain that tomorrow. This is about trying to model expectations of the reliability of AI in a quantum way. But it's interesting that, and Jerome has also had studies where initially you get this sort of wavy uncertainty, which seems like quantum models are much more suitable for that. And then suddenly it all gets a little bit like the oscillations compress and it becomes way more regular. So it's almost like, in order to model such situations, you initially need to have a quantum model where they don't really have much knowledge about how to do it. And as they learn in the task, the model has to become more and more classical. And towards the end, then you could probably model it as classical model, which the assumption being that their cognitive states have become very determinate because of the knowledge or the heuristics that they've used. They've got definite sort of cognitive states that are at play, and that's why a classical model would be more appropriate, or would be appropriate in order to model
Maybe that sounds very promising.
yeah,
Yeah, maybe.
yeah. Anyway,
Thanks.
that's how I just sort of throw that in. Yeah.
Different question? And then quick follow-up there. So if that's generally true, then I think, that kind of quantum-like, behavior hasn't probably suppressed in the traditional all psychological experiments, right? Where we train the subjects until they get stabilized, until we collect a lot of data from one subject.
Yeah.
So it's much better to do the online experiments where practice is minimum, and then we get a lot of, small amount of the trials. Yeah,
I agree. Totally.
okay, right.
I'm going to ask you a question just to check my understanding of some parts of your talk. So am I right if I say that that you're interested partially, I guess, in modeling changes of mind, but more particularly like the oscillatory behavior that appears to be part of changes of mind?
Well, our main interest is how the mental state changes as a result of more information. The point about oscillation is, well, we're interested in quantum cognition, right? And we thought, well, because there are these tools in quantum theory that show these oscillatory dynamics, whether there is any evidence for it. So I suppose, yeah, both of them, yeah.
Okay, then if you allow me like a small comment there. There's, I think, a reasonably large literature on, models of change of mind, but they're usually just, some kind of Markov model or whatever. There's something interesting, like when people try to use like double well potential like things, and then they change like the geometry of the state space according to different information, blah blah. What appears to me like pretty cool is the oscillatory part that you seem to be bringing out here, because in most of the other literature, like people are just looking at very discrete events, and then they just do like some data fitting, and I checked when the decision was changed, like from option A to option B, but they don't tell you anything about what actually happened in the middle, except noise stuff. You got out of one attractor, you got into the other one. This one seems pretty cool for explaining that sort of black box that appears to be in other models.
Thanks, and you're absolutely right. But the traditional models for opinion change, like sequential sampling models, which are Markov models, are essentially have trouble predicting principled oscillations. Now, it's a premise that such oscillations exist in human behavior, and we don't quite get to this with this experiment because it's based on eye tracking. But it just kind of seems plausible, right? It seems plausible there will be some situations where you get like a principle back and forth before converging, and you're right. I think classical models have trouble doing that. So that's how we try to motivate the idea in our psychology audience, who, like I said, can be very, very skeptical of like complicated pieces of mathematics.
So I have a question about your model. So can you go back to the slide where you show the different behavior when you specify different algorithms? Maybe something like that. So here, the parameter, when you, for example, the case of A, when you specify a specific parameter, you will see this kind of oscillation.
So you may, so over here, you basically have all drift 0 and B as 0.5. Now recall the drifts are meant to guide convergence to those particular options, and D is the Hamiltonian parameter, which determines the speed of the oscillations.
Okay, so I assume that these parameter needs to be fitted for each or different types of cognitive process, right?
So the way we did it is each participant produced each participant did 6 decisions, 2 decisions for each of the 3 scenarios, and we fitted all parameters to the cares for each participant for each decision separately. So, it's standard model fitting, right? We just identify the model parameters and gave us the lowest error in terms of the IC.
Yeah, so my question is kind of about the generalizability of this process. So you're saying that, this oscillation, can be, observable in other, not only in your task, but also, any other different type of tasks. So also you mentioned the quantum Zeno effect. So I'm curious how, this model can explain the quantum Zeno.
All right, so let's talk about generalizability first. And so you're absolutely right. So, that in this modeling exercise, we did many fewer things that modelers typically do these days. For example, there's no room to cross-validate, and we didn't do any cross-validation. So if one were to take seriously the idea that these parameters tells us something about individual differences, one might try to compute some function of the parameters, for example, d versus the drifts, and see how this replicates in other cases. So that would be a statement along the lines that some people, I suppose, are more, I don't want to say quantum versus classical, but in the interest of brevity, I'll do that. So there may be something in terms of like these parameters that tells us, gives us information about the kind of decision maker. Actually, we did try to do something we thought was interesting, but it could be just accidental. So we compute the function of these parameters of the drifts and d. So I think it was the function. It was a function we looked up. So basically it went up with increasing drifts, and it went down with increasing d. And we essentially the output of this function correlated the decision. And the correlation could be accidental because it's only on the basis of one experiment. But I suppose what we're trying to argue is that there is some preliminary evidence that this model fitting exercise and these parameters tells us something about the eventual decision participants make, which it should, because at the end of the day, these are meant to be drifts, right? That's our psychological interpretation. So in terms of generalizability, right? I would very much like to replicate this finding, that there's a finding that a function of the drifts and d give us the eventual decision. But also, it would be interesting if some function of these parameters would be reasonably constant across all the decisions each participant makes. But we've not done enough fast because the paper was already about like 100 pages, and we've lost the will to live towards the end. In terms of the quantum Zeno effect, so the quantum Zeno effect assumes this time-dependent Hamiltonian unitary dynamics. I'm not entirely sure how it would work with open system dynamics, because I don't know. I imagine physicists must have worked this out because I can imagine physicists being interested in how the quantum Zeno prediction holds up in situations where the system cannot be assumed to be isolated, but I don't know. Okay.
Any other question?
To follow up to Yoda's question, I think one of the things we have to be careful of is to try and generalize this. Because I think really the potential of these sort of models is if we can, on an individual basis, reliably fit these parameters, then we actually have sort of a model of an individual doing something. And different people will have different models. And I think that's the real promise of these sort of things, is the individualization of these quantum-like models in various tasks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, but saying I make 10 decisions and you make 10 decisions, right? I suppose it would be attractive if my parameters could be distinguished from yours. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Then I have a separate question about potentially related to what you said actually. So unlike general decision making, Inoki rivalry or other types of the passenger rivalry experiment tend to show that initially people do not see the switch. But then after a while, when they are adapted, then they start to oscillate. So, but you said that this A parameter is kind of cooked up so that it goes down as the A value becomes high or something.
So over here, so in these examples, right, specifically, I look at two parameters. This is a drift from uncertainty to yes. So essentially, the highest parameter is that the more the model should converge towards yes. And this is a drift from no to uncertainty. And so it's a separate mechanism. So in order to get a path like this, where you have essentially strong evidence for a yes decision, you converge strongly to yes straight away, you need to have a lot of things. You need to have a D-low, you need to have A121 and A231. So in this, so now I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I'm just explaining what this is, what conditions you need to get strong convergence to yes in this system. You need drift from no to uncertainty, drift from uncertainty to yes, and the low D.
But my point is actually more sort of general kind of picture. I mean, I and Peter have the grant that try to also talk about something like this in the time domain. But the interesting thing about the quantum cognition project overall is to give us a principled explanation about the relevant, related kind of phenomena in a unifying manner without, really constructing separate and isolated, models, right? And what I was thinking is that, trying to, if we can come up with a general framework of the oscillatory kind of behavior, but in a completely different domain, in a single framework, that would be really nice. Because especially in the Pinocchio rivalry, we know that people start to have a very stable kind of percept, and then afterwards they start to switch. And in this kind of thing, it's the opposite. Initially fluctuate and then stabilize.
Absolutely, and you can't reverse it. So for the example you're mentioning, some tweaking is needed. So in all cases with these dynamics, you go from oscillation to convergence, you can't reverse it. So yes, I think I understand what you're saying, and that picture, at the very least, is incomplete in relation to your example.
If we can do both with us, but with different kind of parameters, then that would be very interesting. If we need to construct a completely different model, then that's the same as a current status of the classical, modeling of the rivalry and decision making. It's many people think it's related, but as far as I know, both are explained completely differently. Like a race model for the decision making, that's established quite a bit. But if you try to apply a race model for the Pinocchio rivalry, it's really weird because the evidence for option A and B are given, equally to left eye and right eye, right? But what happens in the brain is that you immediately go to A or B very, very quickly. And there is no time of this, no uncertain kind of area. But it comes down after you reach to, one decision, So the racing model is very incompatible, I would say, against, rivalry dynamics, but nobody really cares right now. But both of them are generated by the, neural dynamics, so it should be explained in some way in a unified manner.
That's super cool. That's a very intriguing example.
And I think In neuroscience, there are a lot of studies regarding the explore, exploit task. And then usually we switch, when we start exploring, it goes to exploit. It's like a drifting to some point, but then switches to explore condition. To explore.
You can, so people not please go ahead and finish.
Yeah, so that kind of task is I thought something related to now.
I mean, what you're saying, I mean, in principle, you can, I mean, right, so in quantum theory, you don't do that, right? But in a quantum-like model, you could in principle switch on the D parameter at different points, right? If you want more, I suppose more exploration. But I mean, that would require some careful motivation to keep happy both the physicists and the psychologists. I mean, you know, in psychology, we do all sorts of approximations, right? In many models where we use unitary dynamics, we just decided to collapse at the same time, you know? I mean, it's just that, you know, our use of these quantum tools is sometimes quite different from the way physicists employ them. But yeah, I mean, like if you had like some theoretical reason as to why you'd start from a stable state and then increase oscillation, you could posit, I suppose, a switching on of the Hamiltonian parameter halfway. But you need to justify that carefully.
I'm also curious whether this kind of dynamics can be also modeled by instrument-like idea, and especially you mentioned the unitary dynamics is symmetric. I mean, commutative,
Commutative, yes.
right? So,
Well, in these simple examples like this one.
right, but if my very naive idea is that when the evidence switches from positive to negative, psychologically it feels something different happens. So at that point, maybe the rule changed in some way to, you know, with the instrument like, you know, rule, and to, you know, break this, you know, order symmetry unitary dynamics into yeah, order sensitive kind of dynamics. I don't know how to describe this, but yeah, what do you think about this possible?
If you have two unitaries, but if their rotation over different axes, then they are not commuting.
Yeah.
And the instrumental model is just like that. Each measurement described by the rotation around the different axes. So the instrument can be described by unitary operator on the larger Hilbert space, including measured objects and apparatus. So it's kind of the unitary dynamics, the larger system. However, they can be the non-commutative unitary operator because it is just like the rotation over different axes.
Yeah, so they're commutative in the simple 2D example where I showed. But with unitary, if it's something that's like unitary, you still have the problem of overshooting though, don't you? This problem here, that if you are too close to an eigenstate, you end up overshooting. What one is it?
Or one.
This one, yeah. So, I mean, with the instruments, get around this problem. So here, I've got like this experimental state, which is already close to my eigenstate. I get some evidence which very strongly indicates A, but how do I model that? With the straight unitary rotation, I can't, I'll just overshoot.
Why those two unitaries are commuting?
Sorry?
Why those two unitary operators are commuting?
Well, because they're just simple rotations. So I can
Yeah.
just imagine like this. And then I can flip them, can't I? It's all on the same 2D space, so they're just rotations.
But if usually if you consider the measurement of the two non-commuting observables, they just like the unitary operator rotating one axis and the other axis. If you measuring the two non-commuting spin component,
You need a larger space, like you said earlier.
but
But you would need a larger space, like you said earlier.
yeah.
In
But-
most
but-
applications, we have a simple space like this.
I don't know. If you consider the instrument modeling, your Hilbert space is always larger than the original Hilbert space. Because the instrument is realized by the unitary operator on the system plus environment also. So the dimension of the Hilbert space is larger than the original observed space. So
So you have non-commuting,
yeah.
that's fine, but how would you deal with the problem of overshooting?
So just to make sure, so in this case, X1 and X2 are both evidence towards the same
Yeah,
kind
exactly,
of
yeah.
option. And then you are already close to the
Yes,
decision.
exactly. And you overshoot. That's the problem we have, right, with unitaries. If you're already close to decision and you get a lot of evidence, then if you just rotate, right, it's simple rotation, it just seems you'd overshoot. So that's one problem, just using unitaries in a general way. I mean, it works. If your meta state is down there, then it works. Like, if it's already closed, you have a problem, don't you?
What you're saying is that if the other option is non-commuting with this axis for A, then unitary towards A and unitary towards different option like B is non-commuting, right?
Even
Yeah, that's fine.
two-dimensional Hilbert space, they have many non-commuting unitary operators.
Yeah, yes, but like, yes, there would be, but like, all right, fine, but like, here, we just have two rotations. These would be commuting, wouldn't they? It's one rotation after the other.
You assume that those two rotations are rotation around the same axis.
I do, but
Yeah.
that's the thing, that in the majority of applications, we have like a binary question, right? So the rotations make sense around, as far as we know, right? The rotations make sense only around the same axis. Now with instruments, I understand the general point that, you have more general rotations, so you get rid of the problem of cumulativity, right? But it seems that you still have the problem that you might be overshooting if you're already too close to a decision and you get evidence, strong evidence for that decision. So we're not sure how to deal with that.
I don't know, because if you consider only
Two-dimensional Hilbert space, then they include all the spin operators. Then they include all the rotation on the Bloch sphere. Means that every line can be the axis of rotation on the two-dimensional Hilbert space rotation.
It's good for thought.
Okay. Any other question or comments?
Thank you.
So. Any other question? Then I might they also have something.
Angus has a question.
Yeah, Angus. He probably has a cough, right?
Okay. So I have a question I have a question about damping oscillations and ambivalence. My understanding from the talk is that this damping is supposed to relate it with reduced ambivalence. Is that right?
Yes, but we don't show that directly, right? We fit the curves, but yes, yeah, yes, so yes, it is right. So essentially, so, over here, you know, when oscillations get done, well, yeah, I mean, we assume participants converge to whatever they, you know, whatever their decision would be for this particular question. And of course, when you have oscillation, we associate that with ambivalence.
Okay, so I think the follow-up question is that if so, is it really the case that people's ambivalence generally decrease? For example, after buying a new phone, people might keep looking at other new phones. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. So I don't know in general, but in the context of the experimental paradigm we employed, there is evidence that oscillations, the strength of oscillations is gradually reduced with time. So this is this graph here. So we divided up the decision time for each participant into 5 intervals. And in each of these intervals, we computed the absolute value, the first derivative of the curves. Essentially, the first derivative is a measure of the rate of change of the curve. So if you take the absolute value, the higher it is, all it means is the more violent the changes. And for all 6 decisions, so it's we had 2 decisions, decision 1 and decision 2, for the 3 scenarios. In all cases, there is evidence that the oscillations get gradually smaller as participants approach their decision point. So that's empirical evidence independent of any quantum light modeling.
In this paradigm, can people make a decision when they want to, or you are asking them to fix it for 60 seconds?
In the first decision, so actually, yeah, right. So that's a good question. It's a 30-second sacrifices, right? So so these intervals are not equivalent across the different decisions, because decision 1 was for as long as participants wanted, and it would vary between 10 and 20 seconds. And decision 2 was 15 seconds. So this interval here does not mean the same thing for the red and the blue curve. But nonetheless, that's not the point. It doesn't matter for us. What matters is that in the span of the decision across these 5 intervals, we have a particular pattern.
Then the last question, maybe before go to lunch, is can you go to the general knowledge slide, system of the environment, Murphy and Medin?
Which one?
The Murphy and Medin.
Murphy and Medin, yeah.
Yeah. Sounded interesting, but I didn't really fully understand what.
I didn't explain it terribly well. It's so Murphy and Medin were primarily categorization researchers, and they set out to Murphy and Medin set out to explain why we have the categories we have. Now, for some categories, it's easy. Say a category like desk, you know, like desks are kind of similar to each other. But for other categories, it becomes much more complicated, like things like game, for example, or you know, recreational activity. And their categorization theory was, they called it the theory view of categorization, according to which what makes categories cohere together is the fact that there's an underlying theory binding the exemplars together. That is, there's a theory for what, say, a horse is, and this binds all exemplars of horse-like experience together. Now, I suppose I use that as an example of how psychologists are sort of trying to invoke the notion of general knowledge in psychological theory, but of course, in very non-quantitative vague terms. And the point I was trying to get to is that, you know, I mean, I think everybody takes it for granted that there's no hope of modeling general knowledge in precise terms, because I've no idea what Yota or you or Peter think. But maybe we can just kind of approximate the interaction between the general knowledge and the information specific to the task by consistent dynamics.
So general knowledge here is what the person knows.
General knowledge is everything that constitutes our knowledge. So it would be our experience, our beliefs, everything. And of course, it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly complex, and also all, as far as we know, different beliefs just interact with each other in very complex ways. That was a problem Fodor mentioned as well, because higher order cognitive processes like decision making, categorization, etc., are subject to our general knowledge, are impossible to study. But maybe they're impossible. I suppose the problem-like answer might be maybe they're impossible to study in precise terms, but maybe we can approximate the impact this general knowledge has on particular tasks by dynamics like this.
Thank you. If there is no further question, comments, then yeah, let's finish. Thank you,
Thanks
Emmanuel.
very much. Thank you very much.
And let's talk really and yeah. Then we will go to lunch.